In the earlier podcast, you heard about the survival mechanism within every human being. A survival mechanism functions as an operating system on a laptop or a mobile. Having the latest operating system on your mobile or a laptop is useful when you use it. Just like someone must operate the operating system in a computer, similarly, it's important to have an operator for our survival mechanism. Today, you will learn about another system that prevails within us. This mechanism is so powerful that even our survival mechanism has to adhere to it. The subject for today's podcast is the self governs you. The concept of the self has been explored by intellectuals, philosophers, psychologists, religious leaders, and New Age gurus alike. This podcast, however, is not a sermon or a lecture on the topic. Instead, it's aimed to reveal what the self truly is and how it operates. If you are interested in exploring the idea of the self, I recommend checking out my book, The Self Decoded. From the moment we are born, there is a system that controls us. We are unaware of its working and how it functions within us, but we often acknowledge its existence in our spoken language using the following phrases. I do not trust myself. I often talk to myself. I'm angry with myself. I hate myself. I'm proud of myself. In the sentences I have just mentioned, it looks like two people are communicating. To further elaborate, let's focus on the sentence, I am angry with myself. If we substitute I with Jack and myself with Jill, the sentence becomes, Jack is angry with Jill. This clearly implies that two people are involved and one is feeling angry towards the other. If we replace pronoun with a proper noun in the sentence, I talk to myself, then it will be Jack talks to Jill. This suggests that when we talk to ourselves, we are essentially talking to another part of ourselves known as myself. It seems as though we have two distinct personalities within us, I and myself. The question remains, who is I? Who is myself? Who is doing the talking? One may ask oneself, are we our split personalities? Before you draw a conclusion, let me further elaborate to you. What is self? Or who is the self? When a child is born, they are dependent on their parents for their survival, including protection, food, clothing, shelter, and other essentials. This dependency lasts for the first 3 years of their life. As the child grows, they become aware of who their parents are, and during these crucial formative years, parents establish rules and guidelines for the child to follow. This instruction serves as a foundation for the child's survival as they grow up to be teenagers. Even if you have a high-tech computer with the latest operating system and applications, you still need someone to operate it. Similarly, in the absence of our parents or guardians, our inner self takes on the role of an operator. The survival mechanism accesses the instructions and rules stored in our memory, assuming they are beneficial for us, and follow them. Our survival mechanism depends on the self for the protection of the body. Without the self, the mechanism can become dysfunctional. Let's take an example. Manoj was raised by vegetarian parents who considered eating non-vegetarian food to be a sin. When he went to college, his friends enjoyed non-veg food, but he refused to have it. His logic and reasoning told him that if others could eat it, it wouldn't be harmful, but he still avoided it. What led him to refrain from consuming non-veg, even though it may have been harmless? What prevented Manoj from having non-veg? How did he conclude what to avoid and what not to? During his upbringing, his parents consistently reminded him that consuming non-vegetarian food was a sin and thus forbidden. Now that he is in college, His peers indulge in non-vegetarian dishes, but he refrains from eating them when his parents are not sitting beside him and having surveillance over him. The rules ingrained in his mind dictates what is permissible and what is not, and breaking them would be a sin. Even if he decides to join his friends in consuming non-vegetarian food to socialize, he would experience a sense of guilt for violating the rule. In the future, to avoid negative emotions, he may distance himself from his non-vegetarian friends. As the child grows, they internalize their parents' instruction, and these messages become beliefs and part of their identity, known as the self. The parents are the foundation of the child's sense of self, consistently reminding them of what behaviors are acceptable and which is not. The child's sense of self operates like a set of guidelines or instruction manual with rules for what is allowed and what is not. The self is an imaginary entity that replaces the physical presence of our parents. As children, we internalize the rules and regulations taught to us by our parents, creating an imaginary entity known as the self. This entity takes the place of our parents' physical presence and guides us unconsciously as we grow older. The rule book instilled in us during the childhood becomes our compass for survival, ensuring that we continue to follow those guidelines even without our parents' presence. As adults, we have surpassed the survival stage, but we still operate under the influence of the same system, the self. It has conditioned our habits, thinking, and behaviors to operate in a specific way. This inbuilt mechanism is challenging to defy, as it has a powerful grip on us because it originates from our creators. In the previous podcast, I explained our core beliefs. Within those core beliefs, our parents and others keep adding new rules and regulations that are essential for our survival. No amount of logic and reasoning can be applied to those fundamental beliefs because they get processed on emotions. The Manoj's story is a testament to the power of the self. It monitors our behaviors and can make us feel guilty or other negative emotions if we don't meet its expectation. As we grow up, our dependency on the parents and other authority figures decreases, but the self's influence remains strong as it dominates the survival mechanism. It compels us to follow its guidance throughout our lives. As you age, your sense of self expands beyond just your parents and includes other influences like relatives, neighbors, teachers, role model, religion, and culture. Manoj was taught to be a vegetarian by his parents and his relatives as a religious belief. When he was younger, he didn't challenge these beliefs because survival was his primary concern. Even if he wanted to resist, he would be disciplined with rewards and punishment. In the previous podcast, the idea was presented that each of us is the product of the goals and dreams of others, and that our purpose is inherent within us. Our parents and other caretakers have nurtured and protected us. Our body is their creation, and they give us our appearance, names, and identities. The survival mechanism is also unconsciously installed by them. Without them, we would not exist. Our parents continue to play a significant role in our lives, defining who we are and who we will become. Like a potter shaping the clay, our destiny is predefined by our parents, and accordingly, the self continues to play its role. A pot is created by the potter, meaning it cannot challenge the potter. The same principle applies to a child. Our survival mechanism makes us aware of our creators, and it is essential to follow their guidance. In each of the three survival mechanisms, the self takes on a distinct role. For the wanted child, seeking to prove their worth, they constantly strive to gain the parents' trust by living up to their expectation. They exhibit qualities such as loyalty, commitment, and integrity, but often at the cost of sacrificing their own needs, as in the case of Amit mentioned in the episode The Trap, Meeting Others' Expectation. The partly wanted child has a limitation of being a good boy, good girl, not being able to say no to others. By pleasing others, they are seeking acceptance. They are physically hardworking, making others happy for their survival. But in doing so, at times, they are taken advantage of and exploited. They possess qualities such as resilience, patience, and generosity, but their focus on pleasing others can leave them feeling frustrated and unsure of what to do next. Children who are unwanted from the conception often possesses a strong drive to survive at all costs. They have developed resistance to rejection and are persistent, persuasive, and focused on achieving their goal. They possess a unique mechanism that helps them to cope with rejection that they have experienced from their parents. This mechanism is beyond their understanding and takes over their sense of self. In the previous podcast on decision making and who controls your destiny, I shared the story of Amit, how his mother's influence has left him feeling helpless and trapped, that he is thinking of making a premature exit. Who and what compelled Amit to do so? Even though she doesn't physically live with him in Mumbai, she goes with him everywhere he goes in the form of a self. That self constantly reminds him of his purpose and fulfillment of her expectation. As a result, Amit feels compelled to meet her outcome, even if it means sacrificing his own desires in life. Let's take a contrary argument. What if Amit had taken a drastic decision of premature exit? Who would you have blamed for his decision? Knowing the story, many of you would point a finger at his mother. It is she, in the form of the self, that decides his fate. While his mother may have played a significant role in his life, she still holds control over him through the self. This means that the self has the ability to both create and destroy us. Amit's survival mechanism is trapped and unable to overcome the dominance of the self. He sees no way out of his catch-22 situation and feels hopeless. Self is an integral part of our lives. While it serves as a protector and aids in our survival, it also tends to restrict our growth, progress, and freedom. Our survival mechanism has always followed the self's rules and regulation, and it is challenging for it to defy the self. If our survival mechanism doesn't follow the rules, it can jeopardize our body's existence. Fear works as a signal to alert the mechanism of potential danger, which forces it to comply with the self. Although designed to aid our protection and survival, both the self and the survival mechanism can significantly limit our freedom and force us to live in a perpetual state of fear. Often, we must make compromise, even when there is no real threat to our livelihood. Since our survival mechanisms are governed by the self, what emotions we will experience also depends on the self. Let me give you some highlights of the self. The self defines our relationships. The first and the most important relationship is with our parents, who are our creators. Our future relationships are influenced by this primary bond. Although our parents are born with survival mechanism, each parent has different ones. It is similar to the way magnet works. Opposite poles attract each other. Similarly, couples with different survival mechanisms come together. As you age, you may find yourself unconsciously drawn to a partner who embodies the survival traits of one of the dominant parents from your upbringing. If you are raised by adoptive parents who played a significant role in your upbringing, your spouse may become the substitute partner in your life having similar survival traits. Whether you fall in love or get married or have an arranged marriage, the rules remains the same. Some of my clients had arranged marriages initially, but later separated and then had love marriage with someone who had the same survival mechanism. Our internal mechanisms are so designed and conditioned that we tend to attract the same type of person we experienced while growing up. This can be viewed as a law of attraction in action. The self talks. All of us engage in internal dialogue within our minds. Referring back to one of the sentences mentioned earlier in the podcast, I often talk to myself. I frequently ask my clients the following questions. Who is talking to whom? Who is I? Who is myself? The answer I receive is always the same. Both are me. As infants, we naturally absorb information through our five senses, including the sound and language spoken by our parents. We tend to record and later use it in our conversation. This early exposure tends to shape our own speech later in life. Essentially, our parents are the primary influence on our developing sense of self, as they are the first to communicate with us. As we grow, the self keeps on expanding as we interact with more and more people around us. The internal talks and dialogues that you hear within you are actually voices of others that have been recorded and stored within you since your childhood. Our minds take these spoken words, go in an internal search like a Google search engine, and finds and retrieves corresponding past data that possibly matches the current prop. However, when we have a non-stop internal dialogue, we may experience different emotions such as fear, anger, shame, criticism, or pride. These emotions trigger unresolved issues from the past, causing us to get stuck in a non-stop loop of negative thoughts. The self controls our decision making. In the previous podcast titled, Decisions, Who Makes Them For You?, I discussed how our decisions are influenced by others, that is, the self and past experiences. Our past data shapes our decision-making process and is a reflection of the self. Since all the data we have in the form of the past, it inevitably affects our present and future decision-making. Earlier in this podcast, I briefly spoke about Manoj as an individual who follows a vegetarian diet. It's important to consider what factors led to this decision to adopt this lifestyle. Did Manoj make his choices freely, or was he unconsciously influenced by others? Our decision-making process is heavily influenced by the self, of which we are unaware. The self governs our destiny. In my previous podcast about destiny, who governs it for you, I didn't explicitly mention the concept of the self. However, our parents and other factors represented by the self play an important role in shaping our destiny in ways that we cannot comprehend. If you are interested in learning more, you can listen to my previous podcast. The self generates stress. Most of the stress what we experience is also generated by the self. Our internal mechanisms are driven by the self, and most of the time we feel compelled to function in a specific way, as if a loaded gun is put on our heads. As we always fear, if we don't function to a specification given to us, something undesirable will happen. For instance, Manoj, who is vegan, experiences the stress of eating non-veg because that would be a violation of the law of the creators, and the self always reminds him of its consequences. In earlier podcasts, we saw Amit, who was under tremendous pressure to comply with his mother's demand. Every survival mechanism has different ways of generating stress. For more in-depth understanding, you can refer to my book mentioned earlier. During our formative years, our parents, with good intentions, instill various rules and guidelines for our safety and well-being. These beliefs have become ingrained in our psyche and now forms part of the self, which unconsciously governs our lives. As adults, we continue to be controlled by these internalized beliefs. The self controls our thoughts and actions through the survival mechanism, and we can feel trapped. Since the survival mechanism is pre-installed by the self, it must comply with its demand. To grow and evolve as individuals, it's crucial to update and correct these misconstructs that resides within us. Those commands in the form of beliefs continue to get activated with different triggers around us. Currently, a powerful trigger could be your spouse playing the role of the self, can trigger those commands and you could be reacting to them. The self operates like an entity within us, having a strong grip throughout our lives. It does its best to safeguard us from possible dangers with all the data it has acquired, but most of it is outdated and obsolete. It is impossible for us to overthrow the self, but its misrepresented data can be upgraded and reconditioned, for which it is essential to have a deep understanding of its internal working. We all have the opportunity to consciously update the self by increasing our awareness and upgrading our past distortions. The more you understand the self, the more you evolve for the better. It's time you take charge of your life and start updating the self that will help you to live life with freedom. To listen to more podcasts and to watch YouTube videos, please feel free to visit my website at www.livingwithfreedom.com. I also have 2 books available for purchase on various platforms: Stop Surviving, Start Living with Freedom, and The Self Decoded. The better you know who you are and the working of your internal mechanism, the more likely you will experience joy and peace. In the upcoming podcast, you will have an opportunity to learn something new and unique. In the meantime, I encourage you to look for opportunities to express gratitude for everything around you. See you next week.